Hello and welcome to the Ocean Impact Podcast. I'm your host, Tim Silverwood. Now, this episode came out at the very end of 2020, which means we're wrapping up the first year of Ocean Impact Organisation's public existence. It's been an incredible year and it's been wonderful to celebrate in the last couple of weeks all that we have achieved. Particularly proud of this podcast, which is now going to end the year with 36 episodes published. I hope you've enjoyed them. Before we get stuck into 2021, it will be wonderful to have all of you folks out there saying something nice about the podcast. Consider it a little holiday gift for Nick and I to tell some more people about the podcast. The numbers are great, but we think with a little bit of support, the reviews that you can all submit, we can help to reach more passionate listeners who are driven to help Planet Ocean. In this episode of the podcast, we speak with Jess Melbroune-Thomas, who has perhaps one of the most interesting job titles I've heard. She is a knowledge broker at the CSIRO. She was the 2020 Tasmanian Australian of the Year winner. She's a superstar of STEM. She's an IPCC lead author. And she talks about her story in growing up in Tasmania, a place that is suffering a lot of devastating impact as a result of warming waters associated with climate change, what's that's doing to beautiful, pristine kelp forests that she's been diving in since she was a teenager, and talks all about the wonderful work that she's been doing, heading down to Antarctica, and all sorts of experiences she's had along the way. We really respect all that Jess has done for Planet Ocean and hope that you get a lot out of this episode of the Ocean Impact Podcast. Can't take the ocean out of me. Very pleased to have on the podcast today Dr. Jessica Melbourne-Thomas, who is a research scientist and knowledge broker for the CSIRO. She's been a superstar of STEM, a Tasmanian of the Year. Her bio and credentials are quite significant, but we're going to dive into that today. How are you, Jess?
I'm really well, thanks, Tim.
Really appreciate your time on the podcast today. I'm sure we're going to have a conversation that covers lots of different fields and areas, and people are going to find it really inspiring. But why don't we start where I like to start, which is at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about you and particularly your love for the ocean and for wild places.
Yep, absolutely. I'd love to talk about that. So I grew up in Tassie, exploring all our magnificent wild places near the water, under the water, and also up in the mountains. My brother, who's also a marine scientist, tells a story that I actually don't remember, but it's probably true that Dad used to hold us upside down by our feet and dunk us in rock pools.
With goggles or without goggles?
Yeah, with mask and stuff.
That's so cute.
But we both learnt to, we did lots of snorkeling when I was a kid, and then we both learnt to scuba dive with my dad and have dived as a family for as long as I can remember. So that was pretty special, and I think was, formative in terms of me developing my love for the ocean and ending up following a career in that field.
I'm the same, actually, in that my earliest experiences with the marine, aside from it splashing against my legs, was rock pools and just this entire universe opening up before my eyes. So maybe take us to some more of those memories that you hold about early experiences in the ocean.
Yeah, so I guess some of the most memorable ones are from, when I was old enough to actually scuba dive and to be kind of enveloped in that amazing world. I had to wait. My brother's 2 years younger than me, so I had to wait till he was old enough before I was allowed to learn. So this is around when I was 16, so not kind of, not a tiny person experiencing that environment, but we just have some stunning sites to dive in Tassie. We have some of the best underwater cave systems in the Southern Hemisphere, and exploring those and discovering all the amazing marine life is really memorable. Giant kelp forests, diving through those. If you haven't, I don't know if you've dived in a kelp forest, but it's like, it's like you're flying through a real forest, and the birds around you are the fish, and you're weightless, and the incredible effects of the light. So those things are just so much part of who I am. And then going on to dive in tropical locations. Haven't dived in Antarctica. Have maybe that's a story for later. Have fallen into the water through the ice in Antarctica, but
didn't have all the right equipment.
I haven't had the pleasure of diving there, but yeah, lots of very special memories.
Now, obviously, the kelp forests in Tasmania are hugely at risk, and many have been lost. Tell us a little bit about the kelp forest now compared to when you were a 16-year-old diving, and what they might be like into the future.
Yeah, so I think the latest estimates are that around 95% of the kelp forests have been lost from the east coast of Tassie, and it's a complex story that is related to climate change. So it's partly that as the warmer waters from the East Australian current extend further south to Tasmania, those water conditions aren't as ideal for kelp, but also the extension of those warmer waters means that the larvae of long-spine sea urchins can survive down here, and so we've seen large increases in populations of those urchins, which eat the kelp, and then can maintain this really different environment where they talk about urchin barrens, which is just bare rocks, and the kelp isn't able to grow back. And then the other complicating part of that story is that the only natural predators for those urchins are really big rock lobster, and because that's the size range that's been targeted by fishing efforts historically, it means that there's less stuff around to eat urchins. But the good news part of that is that does give us options to try to manage the decline of the kelp, but I think that given how much the environment has changed, it's almost impossible to see a recovery to the extent of the kelp forests that were there historically, and even the kind of experiences that I had when I was growing up seeing those forests.
How does that make you feel? Because often when we think about the projections of the impacts of climate change, we romanticize that, it's going to happen beyond the time scale of my own lives, and it's not until we sort of speak to people who have this real world example of, no, you don't understand, I've seen it change in the last decade or 2 decades. So how does that make you feel, and do you use that as a way to harness your enthusiasm for creating change?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a powerful personal story, and it's certainly one that I use when I talk about the impacts of climate change to broader audiences. And I think the other one that people relate to is the changes that we're seeing for the Great Barrier Reef and for coral reefs worldwide, and just how quickly that's happened, how difficult it will be to reverse that change, and the fact that, from my personal perspective, my children will never see a Great Barrier Reef the way it was when I was able to dive on it. So there's the personal aspect too. I think, it is also an important reflection of the fact that the ocean does play such a key role in the climate change story, and that, it is plays the most significant role in taking up excess heat and carbon dioxide. And so that means that the changes that we're already seeing are in some ways most pronounced in the ocean, and yet that's kind of a little bit out of sight, out of mind. So helping people to connect to that reality in an environment that they might not directly experience, I think, is an important challenge in terms of talking about climate change.
Yes, and certainly the key motivation behind Nick and I and the team at Ocean Impact Organisation is this, messaging around Planet Ocean. And if we can get everyone to consider the ocean in the decisions that we make every day, then we can start to make some decisions that are really going to be for the benefit in the long term, because of all that inertia that's built into the changes that the oceans are experiencing. Let's go a little bit to, obviously, those experiences. Wild places diving filled you with obviously wonder and amazement at the ocean. When did you know you wanted to study and have an academic career and obviously work in science and STEM?
Not early, from what I remember in my school years. I have very few memories of science classes at high school, for instance, and it was much more for me at that stage about art and language and literature. And then in year 11 and 12, I had some really excellent science teachers, and I think that was probably the point where it clicked that was something that I was going to want to pursue. So, and I think having that mixed kind of background, it wasn't, I didn't write when I was 4, I want to be a marine biologist, and then that was set in stone. But that's been a good thing, because some of those other things like debating and public speaking have been really important skills that have been a core part of what I do right through my career. Yeah. Yeah,
you're a brilliant communicator. I haven't had to debate with you yet, but I'm sure you're good at that too.
I frequently lose against my 2-year-old.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about then that academic journey. It obviously started in Tasmania, but took you all the way to Oxford, where you were a Rhodes Scholar.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate to have that opportunity. And that and the Oxford experiences again opened so many different doors. One of my claim to fame is the wrong word, but I had a mixed experience as a Rhodes Scholar. It was an amazing opportunity, but I found it very difficult to fit in there, and I dropped out. So I'm along with Richard Flanagan, who also is is a well-known dropout Rhodes Scholar apparently. I didn't finish my degree. I came back to Tassie and worked in a scuba diving shop and was a dive bum for a few years, and wondered whether academia was really for me. And then very fortunately had the chance to take up a PhD with someone who I'd worked with before, and that kind of, I guess, relaunched things, and I found my feet again. But it was a different kind of experience for me, the Oxford one.
Yeah, well, I know from my personal experiences, just doing a Bachelor of Science, but then desperately needing to go and do a Bachelor of Life, which for me was going surfing. So for you, it was going to work in a dive shop. But sometimes you just need to recalibrate and get a bit of time to sort everything out.
Absolutely.
So what about your PhD and your areas of interest in academic research and studies? Tell us a little bit about what you've done and what you're really focused on into the future.
Yeah, so I guess I've been really lucky in lots of ways, having the opportunity to work kind of right from the tropics to the poles. And so my PhD was on coral reef ecosystems, and I worked in Mexico and the Philippines and Indonesia, which was amazing. And I guess kind of sparked my interest in what we talk about as social ecological systems, so not just the biology, but also how that linked to people that depend on those ecosystems. And then after my PhD, I'd always I did my work experience in Year 9, I think, at the Australian Antarctic Division. And so my dream job was to work there, and I was very lucky to get a job with the Antarctic Division, and so have the opportunity to go to Antarctica. And then more recently had this new opportunity come up with CSIRO, where I've kind of been able to draw the threads of the different things that interested me and that I thought were important together. So it's been, aside from the brief stopover at the dive shop, it's been a really, I've been very lucky in the pathway that I've been able to take so far.
Great. Well, I want to get to Antarctica very soon, but maybe just dive a little bit deeper into your current role. I've never met a knowledge broker before I met you, so tell us a little bit about your current work and what you focus on.
Yeah. So to be totally honest, I'm still figuring it out to some degree. And so the knowledge broker role is a little bit different from, we think a lot about science communication, and I think it's wonderful to see science communication becoming more of a thing, and knowledge brokering is like that, but is more about translation of science to the people that need it in order to make decisions or to make change, and then equally making it a two-way process. So helping to bring that knowledge that an end user or a stakeholder has back into the research process. And so, there are a whole range of these other non-science knowledge sources that are really important in terms of science having more effective outcomes. Our traditional model, right, is do some science in a laboratory or on a computer, write a paper in a peer-reviewed journal, have it published and sit there and hope that somebody that needs that science might pick it up and use it. And given the urgency of so many of the problems in the world now, that model is not really going to cut it. And so we need better ways to engage people and spark their interest and help them see the value in science, which is, I think, science communication, but also pathways to translate that information into a form that's useful and make sure that we're doing science that addresses the problems that are there.
So you mentioned obviously getting it in the hands, the right information, the right format to decision makers and many other entities. A question off the cuff here, but I suppose that role of commercialising science for impact, and that's obviously, alluding to what OIO's mission is, in that if we can stimulate entrepreneurs and startups to build businesses that are regenerative and create a positive impact on the ocean, then we can really start to further the great progress on the great challenges. What do you see in respect to science and commercialisation and that mixture between academia and, I suppose, progressing business?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and we could probably talk for another hour about that. I think one area particularly where that's going to be increasingly important into the future is for what we talk about as the blue economy. And so, Australia is the blue economy, ocean economy is particularly important for Australia, and the kinds of opportunities that are going to open up in the ocean environment, I think, for Australia particularly, will be very important. Things like offshore renewable energy, offshore aquaculture, integrated technologies, moving towards sustainable food production systems. I think that is an area where that integration of science and business and industry and technology is going to be increasingly important.
And there's the Blue Economy Cooperative Research Centre based in Launceston, correct? So
right, yeah.
Putting Tasmania on the map for progressing the blue economy.
Yeah.
Okay, do you want to dive into Antarctica and tell us a little bit about your experiences? I think you went there for the first time in 2013, am I right? And how many times have you been there? Tell us all about Antarctica.
I can try. I have only been once, so I went the once, and then I had babies, and it's it's difficult to to juggle being a mum and typically stints in Antarctica are for quite long periods of time. So I hope to go back again. I was lucky, but it was a 2.5 month voyage that I was on working in the sea ice environment, so kind of very immersed in that Antarctic experience.
Immersed as in like locked in the sea ice and you couldn't leave. So
yeah, we did get stuck. We got stuck for a couple of weeks. It's not uncommon. We ran out of coffee, which almost caused a mutiny. But
is there any marine creatures that can be a substitute for coffee? Because if they are, they would have been targeted by everyone.
So that was on a multidisciplinary research cruise, and it was a really fantastic opportunity to kind of dive into the field work side. And I'd love to have the opportunity again at some stage.
What were some of the memorable experiences? What really, tell us a little bit about just that experience of stepping foot on the ice of Antarctica and obviously all those experiences.
It's cold. So I talked before about having fallen in the water, and so we were stuck in the sea ice, and we kind of just had to wait for a lead to open up so we could get back out. But we were still going out onto the ice every day to do our science, and it was this incredibly beautiful sunny day, a minke whale, which is like one of the smaller species of whales in the Southern Ocean popped its head through a small gap to breathe, and it hung around for easily half an hour, and we were able to be quite close and take photos and things. And I got a bit too excited and distracted, and I stepped on a thin patch of ice, and I just went straight through into freezing cold water underneath. But now I can tell the story that I've swum with a minke whale in Antarctica.
But we all know the truth now because you just divulged it.
Yeah. So that was memorable.
Yeah. What else? What other sort of wildlife encounters? What were some of the the real highlights from that particular expedition?
Penguins are very curious. I don't know if you've seen those photos on social.
Only in the surf, but
yeah. Well, they come right up to check out what you're doing and inspect and check out the equipment, and just generally hang about, and so that was pretty cool. And we saw lots of crab eater seals. They're pretty amazing to watch. And they make the most of, we were drilling holes in the ice and things, so they'd make the most of being able to pop up through those holes. And and just the scenery generally, and the different ice forms, and the light effects, and really surreal and stunning.
And what about some of the science you were performing down there, and what was the focus, and why was that so important at the time, and for obviously the future?
So my work on the Southern Ocean and for Antarctica was in marine ecosystem modelling. So I kind of have a background that integrates maths and ecosystem science to develop tools that can be used to project how ecosystems might change in the future under climate change, but also to support decision making for things like fisheries management. So there's a general perception that modelers don't do field work, that we sit in front of computers, but having the opportunity to be in the real system that you're trying to represent, in this mathematical model, I think is really critical. And also I was looking particularly on that voyage at algae growing in the sea ice. So sea ice in Antarctica has this fundamental role in terms of supporting the ecosystem, and also important links to climate more generally. But it's a home to this incredible diversity of life, actually, microscopic life. And the algae grows in the ice and also underneath it, and then that provides food for zooplankton and krill, that then supports things higher up in the food chain. So understanding where and how that algae grows and how that might change in the future is actually really important in terms of us making predictions about how the ecosystems might change.
I remember I think it was a video, I don't know how long ago it was, but you spoke about the total catch of krill in the Southern Ocean, Antarctica, and it was astounding, the figure. It was something like 11% of the total catch quota of the world was being absorbed by krill in the Southern Ocean. Do you recall that? And is that still the case?
So krill, the population of krill is massive, and it's all around the Southern Ocean. I think it's by biomass, it's the largest single species. Sorry, I'm not very good with statistics. You call me. One of those people that statistics don't stick in my head, but the krill biomass is very high. It's one of the largest for these kind of small invertebrates, and it's possible that krill will be fundamentally important in supporting global food security in the future. It's a massive resource there, and as stocks reduce in other areas, we may increasingly depend on food from the Southern Ocean, particularly because as waters warm, a lot of stuff is moving south as well, so we will see new fish stocks emerge. And the krill, because it's difficult to collect data in the Southern Ocean, and also because management of fisheries in that region is through an international commission that in lots of ways is kind of world standard for ecosystem-based management. the management of krill fishing is precautionary, right? So with limited information, we opt for the safest route. And so I think the statistics that you're referring to is the potential overall catch limit for Antarctic krill. But at the moment, we only harvest a tiny proportion of that because there's a need to better integrate data in terms of how fishing activity on krill might affect the rest of the ecosystem, and also how that might change with climate change. So yes, krill are very important for a whole bunch of reasons and likely to be more important. And I can't remember the statistics without having them in front of me, and I didn't prepare.
Well, that is reassuring, I guess, because I think people, particularly, the layperson, is going to imagine that, krill, albeit massive biomass, we think about those whales and this important feedstock for them and many other cascading organisms, and to think that we're harvesting it for a krill supplement in people's lives that perhaps they don't need is where I guess I was led in that conversation. So what about in terms of any other pressures that you're particularly concerned about on the Southern Ocean and Antarctica? Is there other, human practices and commercial practices down there that really concern you?
So I'm not sure really concerned is necessarily the way I would describe my thinking about the human related pressures in Antarctica, but it's certainly the case that tourism numbers have been skyrocketing in some parts of Antarctica, the easy to access parts, and the fact that ice is melting just makes those regions more accessible. And I think it's inevitable that increased human presence in those regions will have effects on the ecosystem. And so, and then obviously things like plastic pollution are a concern for those regions as well. And so understanding how we can manage those different pressures in the context of climate change as this overarching driver, I think, will be particularly important.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you tell us a little bit about Homeward Bound, which is a project that you're a co-founder of, which has got a huge focus on, I believe the goal is supporting 1,000 women in STEM over 10 years. I'd love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Homeward Bound was the vision of Fabian Dattner, who I worked with in the early stages of getting that project off the ground. And it is a Australian-led international program that focuses around women in science and leadership, and is about amplifying the voices of women in terms of using science to address the challenge of climate change particularly, and given that female representation at senior levels in science and in leadership generally is still so low. Homeward Bound was about trying to build a global network of women who could support each other in having more of a presence in that space. And so it's set against the backdrop of Antarctica, and practically speaking, Homeward Bound has sent large shiploads of women on leadership journeys to Antarctica over successive years. And so I think we're up to voyage number 5, which may be on hold because of COVID, but about 100 each time. And if we do that for 10 years, then that's the 1,000 women. But actually I think just because it captures people's imaginations, it's something that's kind of created waves and actually built a much bigger network than the women that have actually been on the voyages. And in fact, there's a documentary that was filmed on the first Homeward Bound voyage that is being shown at the moment at the Sydney Film Festival, and tells some of the story of what Homeward Bound was trying to achieve and what some of the challenges were in bringing into reality a program like that.
What's the name of the film? Do you know, so we can keep an eye out for it?
The Leadership. So it's online at the moment, and I think until the 21st of June it's available for people to access. You just pay a fee to rent it, I think, but I haven't watched it yet. It's a bit hard to find time around the family.
Add it to your watch list.
Looking forward to seeing it. Yeah.
Well, that sounds incredible and absolutely so critical. So why don't you just talk a little bit more about the importance of women in leadership positions in STEM and the importance of diversity in decision making?
Yeah, so we know that diversity in so many contexts brings better outcomes because it provides flexibility in the way people think about solving problems, and the different viewpoints that they can bring to the table. And so there's evidence that in research you get better outcomes, research outcomes with more diverse teams, and that's certainly the case, as I understand it, in business and in leadership more generally too. And so, one of the motivating factors behind Homeward Bound was that given the climate crisis, we just can't afford to be missing close to half the voice in that decision-making process, and that the rate at which things are changing, not just for women in science, but in terms of diversity and equity, I guess, more generally, it's too slow, and we can't afford that time. And one of the catchphrases that was developed for Homeward Bound was "Mother Nature needs her daughters." But Fabian was very interested in the way that women can bring a kind of caregiving perspective to how we interact with our planet and the ocean and places like Antarctica, and the role of women as mothers, and how we can bring that perspective more into the way we think about creating change to address global problems. And I think, Jacinda Ardern is amazing. I love seeing what she does, and she's an incredible role model. But people like that and that really different style that they're able to bring, and I think it's not just women who can adopt that style, but we're very used to, a less inclusive approach across many different areas, and I think we need to turn that around if we're going to act in time, particularly on climate change.
I know that at least the social media audience for OIO is heavily skewed towards women. Not too sure on the podcast numbers, but sort of what would you say, I suppose, to particularly young women who are perhaps going through their academic journey or starting their careers? Sort of what would you say to them, or where would you steer them to really be able to feel thoroughly motivated, that there's no barriers to their success?
Yeah, I think it would be misinformation to say there are no barriers. There are still some important barriers, but I think there's a lot of different initiatives that are building momentum to try to move those barriers. But there's a lot of challenges that remain. I think I've seen evidence that COVID, for instance, has had a more significant impact on the rate at which women are submitting academic papers, which are really critical in terms of how we currently recognise success and career advancement. So, there's still disproportionate effects of things like the pandemic on women. But certainly building networks and seeking out role models and champions, I think, is a really important thing that individuals can do. Looking back on my Oxford experience as a Rhodes Scholar, I think I hadn't realised at the time, but one of the main issues for me there was that it was still a very male-dominated space. Then, this is back in 2003. I think things have been changing since then, but it's difficult when you can't see anyone around you who has navigated barriers or who has been there and learnt from those challenges. So I think that's really important. And I have a good degree of hope that things are turning around, and that for future generations we might actually see equal opportunities. that would be wonderful.
Certainly would.
Yeah.
We spoke a little bit there about sort of COVID, and now I suppose this sort of re-emerging to a new normal. Maybe we could start to talk about, your role with the IPCC, the current state of the climate, and maybe even starting out by sort of, I guess, climate in the context of COVID. Has it? There's a lot of people out there with opinions. Do you think it's been a good thing, this disruption, this great pause? Maybe just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I have been really encouraged to see the way that through COVID, science has played an important role, not everywhere, but I think, certainly from what I have seen, people have listened to science, they have acted quickly on advice based on science, and they have done that collaboratively in the most part, and then have seen the benefits of doing that, right? So I think that's a really powerful demonstration of how things could look for the challenge of climate change, although they're very different. They're different cases in many ways, both global problems that are playing out over slightly different timescales. So that's encouraging that we have seen reductions in emissions because of COVID and changes in behaviours. So that's another a positive thing in that we can see that it is possible to change behaviours and achieve outcomes like that. I've also seen COVID talked about as like a sliding doors moment for addressing climate change, and that now really actually is an opportunity to turn things around and to press the reset button. I don't have a clear vision of whether that actually can play out, but I would be hopeful that it can. And I think it does seem that people are thinking slightly differently about issues, like the Black Lives Matter rallies and the support that is being shown for those. So maybe there is a change in mentality where people are starting to think differently. I don't know.
Really appreciated seeing, even just the changing rhetoric in celebrities, for example, talking now more than ever about this idea of interconnectedness with nature, and obviously intersectional environmentalism, and people really starting to get a bit more of a picture, a snapshot of the bigger picture, which is sort of entering the mainstream, which I think is a good thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I definitely agree. Yeah.
What about the IPCC then? Tell us a little bit about your journey in being a lead author with the IPCC. What sort of the big takeouts from that, and what should we be thinking about as we go into this next chapter of the human story?
Yeah, I can try. I worked on there were 3 special reports that the IPCC developed between it has these regular assessment cycles. So there was the 5th assessment report, and then these 3 special reports, and the 6th assessment report is currently in process. And the 3 special reports were on climate change and land, on 1.5 degrees of warming, and on the oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. So I worked on the oceans and cryosphere one, on the chapter on polar regions, but also had some contributions to that report's summary for policymakers, which is the short, sharp version that captures the key elements and that is agreed by all the governments. So it was a pretty interesting process just to be involved with, and to have a better understanding of I guess the rigour that the IPCC uses in the report development, and the number of drafts, the number of contributing authors, the number of reviewers, and the approach that it uses for synthesising really large bodies of science into meaningful statements that end up in this summary for policymakers. So I learned a lot from being part of that process. I guess the sobering thing is that, a lot of the findings from that special report that I worked on were more extreme than previous reports. So we have a clearer picture that things are changing in many respects faster than we had thought previously, and that the impacts that we will see play out, particularly in ocean environments over the coming decades, are more severe, if anything, than we had thought before. And so that means our window for acting and also for adapting to the changes that are already playing out is even smaller. I think, there's a lot of value in those, the summaries that are delivered in terms of providing advice to the people that need to act, but there's still the step to take in actually responding to that challenge.
Just in sort of tying it back to that previous question about COVID, and that we saw politicians standing up side by side next to leading scientists, and we also saw that when politicians and when nations really want to act and act fast in the face of a dire predicament, then they can move mountains in minutes. So does that lend you to thinking, is there something we're missing with the clear evidence of climate change and the impending doom? We all want to try and create the sense of urgency. Many of us have already tried, but do you lend yourself to any thought about, well, what is the secret here? Is there anything we can learn from recent affairs that can somehow create that sense of urgency and move things faster?
I think, the power of bottom-up change is something that, that the effective individual actions can have an effect that's much bigger than the sum of the parts, so the fact that everybody individually changed their behaviours in the case of COVID, and that had a really noticeable change on flattening the curve and on the impact from the pandemic, particularly here in Australia. I think that's a really useful lesson in the context of climate change, because through the various communication events that I've been involved in around climate change, there's, from the general public at least, I think there's often a feeling of helplessness, that it has to be, what can individual actions achieve? There's a need for action at the political level, but I think, on climate change, individual actions actually really can make a very meaningful effect. And so I think there's some bridges to cross to see that same strength of the bottom-up effect for climate change, but maybe this experience has been empowering for people in that context. I'm kind of skirting around your question a little bit and coming at it from the other angle. But I think, if in the everyday we can make the changes that are needed, then maybe we can see cascading effects further up the chain.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we do need to focus on that, because I guess for the cynics out there who've been, told that line about, many millions of small actions make up to a big one, it always felt potentially a little bit fluffy. And I mean, I'm an advocate for it, right? I built up Take 3 for the Sea and told people, hey, you can help plastic pollution by picking up 3 pieces of trash. Well, I knew that the goal there was just to build a movement of enough people that advocated for a better way of doing things. And so I think you're absolutely right. And whilst the iron is still hot, where we've got a fresh memory that, hey, you know what, we did all band together to combat a single invisible enemy. Let's do it for the next one. I think it's really true. So no, I appreciate your perspective on that. Why don't we start to then sort of wrap up this conversation then? I'd love to talk a little bit about the future for you. You've got 2 young girls. You're in the year where you're awarded Tasmanian of the Year for 2020. What do you have planned for the future? What can we expect to see from you next?
I'm looking forward to the girls being at the age where I can actually sleep in again every so often. Someone said once they can make their own breakfasts, that's a real.
Then they can make you breakfast.
Yeah, that would be nice. I'm a year into my role with CSIRO now, and so things are kind of really starting to settle in and also kick off in lots of ways. So I'm excited about that. Lots happening in all aspects of life. I haven't tended to have a fixed view of what the next 5 to 10 years would have to have in store, and that's worked okay for me so far. So I'm happy to see how things evolve. And I in terms of the kids and what their futures might look like, I oscillate a bit, I guess. Sometimes I'm worried and sad, and at other times I have a lot of hope that those generations will do a better job than we've been able to of turning things around, and that I do think that through education we can help future generations to be problem solvers, and I think that's going to be a key part of the future looking better. So I'm trying to do that in my own little way, teach children to be problem solvers.
I love it. We'll wrap things up then. I'm going to leave it to you to touch on anything that you wanted to talk about today in the podcast, and then wind up with a little bit of a spiel about how people can find out more about your work and your role, or follow your journey.
No, I'm just relieved that those escapee goats that we talked about before you started recording have stayed put for the last hour, and I haven't had to run off. And
we're going to need to provide context now. So before we start the podcast, Jess advised that she'd had some rogue goats that got out of the pen, and the dogs were going a bit haywire. So she expected she'd have to run out the door any minute into the wind and rain, but all good. So any closing words, and where can people follow you or find out more, Jess?
Oh, I hadn't prepared to talk about. I'm on the if you Google Jess Melbourne-Thomas, CSIRO, you can find out about me. I'm on Twitter at the moment. I'm encouraging people to make nominations for the next round of the Australian of the Year awards. I think it's been a year where so many people have stepped above and beyond, and we've seen pretty incredible courage and resilience and leadership and strength. So and it's been an amazing opportunity for me this year to be part of that program. So check out, I guess that's my final little pitch, check out nominating for the Australian of the Year awards if you can think of someone that's done something amazing.
Awesome, Jess. Well, thank you so much for your time. You go and check on those goats, and we look forward to working with you more in the future.
Thanks so much, Tim.
Thank you.
Bye.